Order, order. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee on Monday, the 28th of September 2020. We're delighted to be here today, partly in physical form for the first time since March, and with our witnesses physically here with us, those of us who are in the room, from the Ministry of Defence. And we're looking at the issue of carrier strikes. So it's now well known that the Ministry of Defence has procured and delivered 2 new aircraft carriers, the Queen Elizabeth and the Prince of Wales. They are doing sea trials. They've got 18 Lightning II jets now operating off them, and they were delivered, crucially, for £6.4 billion, which is just 3% above the revised figure announced to Parliament in 2013. However, there is slower progress in developing the crucial support for carrier strike, including Crow's Nest, the support fleet, and also questions to be answered about how the carrier strike will be operated and supported more generally. So we want to get into the nub of some of these issues and obviously talk about the money. I'm delighted to welcome physically in the room our witnesses, Sir Stephen Lovegrove, who's the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence. Welcome back to you, Sir Stephen. Air Marshal Richard Knighton, who's the Carrier-Enabled Power Projection Project Manager, I think, is that? Senior responsible owner at the Ministry of Defence for this project. So welcome back to you, Air Marshal. Charlie Pate, the Director General for Finance at the Ministry of Defence. So critical, as we, of course, a moment's delay in any of these projects is millions or not billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. And Sir Simon Bollom, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Defence Equipment and Support. So welcome back to all of you. Before we kick off into the main subject area, we do have some questions, as you might expect, about other defence-related issues. I'm going to ask Nick Smith, if you'll kick off. Over to you, Mr. Smith.
I've got a question for Mr. Lovegrove. There's a shocking story in Wales, in Pembrokeshire, these last few days about the threatened eviction of many families, I understand, across the country through the Annington homes arrangements that you have. Mr. Lovegrove, how many families are facing eviction because of this decision by the Ministry of Defence?
I'm afraid I cannot answer that question. I'm not aware of the story either to which you are referring, so I am very happy to take that away and respond to you more formally, but I'm afraid I'm unsighted on that.
I understand this is a decision affecting Annington homes that will affect many places across the UK, but you're not aware of it at all?
I'm afraid I'm not. I really cannot give you an answer to that because I don't have the details with me at all.
Okay.
This affects a number of members of Parliament, including myself as well as Nick. When you are replying to Nick, could you perhaps reply to, can you look up every member of Parliament that's affected? Because I've got a letter in front of me here from Annington Homes themselves who said that this is not their doing, they didn't ask for this. This is an MOD thing that was done without consulting them at all, and their position is this doesn't have to happen, they don't need the homes back, so they're baffled as to why this is happening. So perhaps a full response from you would be very useful.
I'd be delighted to do that. I apologise that I don't have the information for you at my fingertips at the moment. I will get onto it as soon as I get back to the department and respond in full.
Thank you. Prior notice we'll be asking about this, so we obviously have discussed this quite a lot before.
So something has gone wrong with the process there, I'm afraid.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
I asked this question more in hope than expectation. Sir Stephen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you give us any update on the timing of either the Strategic Defence Review or the equipment plan?
The Strategic Defence Review is the integrated review is still on time. We are expecting for that to be announced alongside the spending review at some point, probably towards the end of November. Mr. Pate may have sort of more precise details on the timing, but I'm not sure that he probably will. I think it'll still be towards the end of November. We're working very, very hard in the department to make sure that our plans and proposition is fully understood at Number 10, Cabinet Office, Treasury. We're working very closely with other departments on the security beat to make sure that it all fits together. As you know, that we have meaningful challenges which we've inherited over a number of years, and we are hoping that we will be in a position to get a settlement which will resolve those in a very decisive fashion.
So crucially, that will shape the equipment plan. When would we expect to see details of the equipment plan after that?
Well, the equipment plan normally comes out in
the autumn. So we are working, as we wrote to the chair, on the equipment plan for this year in the next few weeks, and we hope to have that out in, as I say, in the next month or so. It will take us a while to work through our planning round from the outcome of the spending review and the integrated review. So I would expect next autumn to be able to publish the equipment plan 21, which will set out those details from those reviews. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tobias Elwood, I should say we're pleased to have the Chair of the Defence Select Committee guesting on our committee today. So Tobias Elwood, over to you.
Chair, thank you for including me today. If I can quickly turn to the pandemic. The Prime Minister has made it clear, as we all understand, another 6 months of difficulties lay ahead before us. In a statement in the House of Commons, the Prime Minister touched on utilising the armed forces in a greater capacity. Have you had any requests for this, and what might you offer?
We have not had very specific requests as yet. The way in which we have gone about this is to place liaison officers with all of the departments who will be affected, effectively all of the departments, in fact, through the rest of Whitehall. We have continued to make sure that there are military personnel who are capable of being deployed at short notice, either for sort of heavy lifting or more usually for planning purposes. As we know, in the first wave, we put on standby nearly 30,000 people. 3,000 people were used in the end, and those are planners. It was perfectly possible for the civil authorities to be able to do the hard work, but the planning was where we added the value. Sir Simon's team at DE&S helped a great deal. There were many hundreds of them actually on the acquisition side, on PPE. So we are gearing ourselves up. We have been thinking about the charging regime, so we will continue to charge marginal cost till the 31st of October. We'll take a view on that afterwards. But until we know exactly what the nature of the problems that the nation will be facing are, we don't quite know what. But we are certainly at a state of high readiness.
Thank you for that. The logistics and transport and the contributions you've made are second to none, and the nation is very grateful. But you are the only department that actually plans for emergencies, that trains for crisis management, that has the strategic thinkers beyond other departments. Do you believe that there's a greater role that you could participate in, not least because we have one of the biggest logistical challenges ahead of us, potentially in 6 months, with the rollout of a national vaccine?
Is there a greater role? I'm sure there will be a different role. The vaccine rollout is something that we have been giving quite a lot of thought to, because clearly that will be a really, really significant logistical challenge. Our view so far has been that this is not the Ministry of Defence's war. This is a national endeavour which requires defence to play its fullest possible part, but it will be a fullest possible part in support of the civil authorities. We will respond as fully as we possibly can to any requests, and we will make as many suggestions as we possibly can if we think can do things better or things could be done differently. But we are looking upon this as broadly a supporting role, but it's a supporting role, as it were, without limit. And I think there will be new challenges, as you say, particularly around vaccines, that we will hope to rise to.
Thank you. Sir Geoffrey. Sir Geoffrey Brown. Want to come in again?
No,
okay,
I'm
no, fine. So Richard Holden, please. Richard Holden MP, if you could unmute. Joining us remotely.
Thank you. I would like to declare an interest as a former in the Ministry of Defence. It's just a very specific question, really, around the Defence Equipment Plan. In the 2019, so in the latest plan, the assessment phase was extended for the life extension programme for the main battle tank. I'm just wondering if that assessment has now been completed, and on how many tanks are actually going to be upgraded in the next round, Stephen.
I think either Air Vice Air Marshal Knighton or Sir Simon will be in a better position to answer that question than I am.
Sure. So the assessment phase was extended in order to be able to work through the potential solution that involved integration of a different turret and a new gun on the tank. That has been pretty successful. You may have seen reporting of the joint venture between Rheinmetall and BAE Systems and with a Challenger 2 tank with that upgraded turret and upgraded gun on it. The team in Army Command and in Simon's team are doing the work right now to develop the business case that we expect to come forward to the Investment Approvals Committee in the next couple of months, and it's from there that we will decide on the level of investment and the detail around the plan and the risk associated with it. So we're not in a position today to say definitively what the plan will be, but the work that was done through the extended assessment phase to reduce the technical risk associated with the redesign of the turret and gun has been completed successfully, and that gives us confidence will help give the Investment Approvals Committee confidence in the recommendation that it's able to make, and should we decide to invest in it at that stage.
Mr. Holden.
Okay. Can you give us any indication that there's been a huge amount of media speculation about maybe they'll scrap the entire thing completely, or there's going to be a reduction in the total number? And with obviously our forces currently now looking at tank training in Estonia to new threats, some resurgent Russia. You've obviously seen a flare-up in the Caucasus. You've obviously got Ukraine, different threats emerging all the time, including from rogue state actors. I mean, has this impacted any of that decision-making?
So the specifics around the approval of a programme, those factors that you describe only play a part in terms of understanding around the requirement, and that's actually quite mature. The wider question around what the forward equipment programme looks like and what the capability priorities are is clearly subject to much debate at the moment through the integrated review and the parallel spending review that the Permanent Secretary has outlined. So to add to the speculation in the media now, I think would be unhelpful from my perspective. But suffice it to say is that the importance of the land operating environment, the land domain, in future operations and in protecting and furthering the UK's interests and protecting our interests. We expect the land domain to play an important part in that in the future. And so as we work through the integrated review, we are looking at a whole range of questions around the future of requirements for land vehicles. And in fact, as the chair of the House Commons Defence Select Committee will know, they have a specific hearing on the totality of the armoured fighting vehicle programme in a couple of weeks' time.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Mr. Holden, one last quick one.
One last quick one. Can we take from that answer that so there will be some tanks, but perhaps not as many as there were previously?
So I'll repeat my answer, which is that all of this is up for consideration as part of the integrated review. And once that's concluded, then I'll be able to answer the question with specificity.
The integrated review that we've been waiting for, I think the lifetime of this committee over 2 parliaments. But anyway, I know that our sister committee, the Defence Select Committee, is looking at this, and I'm sure we'll accept a guest from this committee to interrogate the details on the numbers as well with his members. Okay, thank you very much for that. We're going to move on to the main session on carrier strike. I'm going to come to Mr. Gareth Bacon, but first, before I do that, I'd just like to ask James Wilde to declare his interest. Mr. Wilde.
Thank you, Chair. I was a Special Advisor in the Ministry of Defence until 2017.
Thank you very much. Just to make it clear for the record, and over to Gareth Bacon. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Chair. So, Stephen, since the committee last looked into this in late 2017, there's been a lot of progress. So the Queen Elizabeth was delivered, I think, marginally late, a couple of months. The Prince of Wales was on time, and the budget was, again, slightly exceeded, but by a statistically small amount. How did you turn it around?
We had a moment in 2013, effectively, when we realised that the way in which we were dealing with this was not adequate. And we, at that point, instituted the aircraft carrier alliance, which brought together the department and the main contractors, Babcock, BAE and Rolls. And as a result of that construct, we were capable of aligning the interests of the customer, us, and the supplier, them, much more closely. And I have to say that that is a model that is a much more mature one when there is a monopsony buyer and a monopoly set of suppliers than the version that we'd had before, where effectively we were in an arm wrestle over various aspects of the contract all the time. That meant that there was a body which brought everybody together to discuss issues in a sort of kind of mature and detailed way without an antagonistic feeling to it. There was a variety of different pain share and gain share mechanisms which were very important. There was a sharing of information. We were tighter on our expectations, and I should pay tribute also to Sir Peter Gershon, who was the chair of the Aircraft Carrier Alliance, who played a very, very, very important role in making that difference. And I thank you on behalf of the department for recognising that it did come in, at least by our standards, very close to on the button, and we're very pleased with that. It has to be said that it was sufficiently successful as a construct that we have replicated it in Dreadnought. So we now have a Dreadnought Alliance, again chaired by Sir Peter. Building a nuclear bomber submarine is considerably more complicated, however, than building a submarine, building an aircraft carrier. So there are different complexities there. But even there, we are seeing the benefits of that, a different and rather more mature set of relationships.
Thank you. You've shot my fox on my second question, because I was going to ask you if you've applied those lessons elsewhere. But to a layman, what you've just described is what I would have expected you to do anyway. Why didn't you start off on that process in the first place?
There has been, for a very long time, in defence acquisition, certainly I think since the mid-80s, a belief that the closer that one can replicate the functioning of a competitive marketplace, the better the value will be driven for the taxpayer. And I'm a strong believer myself in market economies, and I wouldn't want to dilute that thinking too far. But the reality of the defence industry and the defence purchasing customer, i.e. the Ministry of Defence, means that a different type of approach needed to be taken. And I think, if I am absolutely honest, we have probably fallen too far into the assumption that seeking to replicate, as I say, a normal functioning market was the way in which to get best value. The Aircraft Carrier Alliance was a departure from that orthodoxy, and one that has paid dividends. The SSRO, the Single Source Regulatory Office, is another sort of aspect of this debate where if we can't see a functioning market, what we try to do is mimic and replicate the activities of that functioning market. That too also has some frictions in it, and setting profit rates, which are just become very complicated when you have monopoly providers and monopsony buyers.
Okay. Marshal Knighton, has there been an example, or has it been done in order to get things back on track, but short-term costs have been deferred for things that will be needed in the future in order to get the carriers into service?
Forgive me, do you mean in terms of inside the programme, or more broadly across defence?
No, inside the programme. So what this committee refers to as shifting things to the right. So things that you're going to need, but in the short term you can put them off until later on.
So you can imagine in a programme that is over £6 billion that runs over, it was the Defence Review in 1998 that concluded that we were going to replace our carriers, and the decision was taken in 2007. So over that period, managing a really complex programme will inevitably see us have to actively and dynamically manage the programme of work, the schedule of that work, and the costs that sit alongside it. So I can't provide you with a specific example of where that will have occurred, but what I can provide is some assurance around the way in which we are managing the programme more generally. So not just the carrier element, but the crow's nest and the F-35s. Because, as Sir Stephen says, in 2013 there was a recognition, not only in terms of the way that the carrier delivery was being managed, but also in terms of the risk to delivery of the carrier strike capability, was that we needed to think about how we brought together the carrier, all the components associated with the delivery of that, and the F-35, all those components, and crow's nest, because all of this needs to come together to actually deliver the capability. And so through that focus or recognition, we appointed a senior responsible owner, which is the appointment that I sit in. I'm the third of the three that there will be who've been the senior responsible owner for the overall programme. And if you were to ask me to pick one thing that has led us to a largely successful position, it is a ruthless focus on the risks in the programme. So by being very clear-eyed about what the risks are, how those risks are going to impact the delivery of a particular milestone, that's enabled us to focus our resources and focus our energies on fixing the right things and getting us to the place that we need to be. Okay. And the second thing I'll add, is just in terms of being really clear about who's responsible for what and what the milestones are. And that helps us avoid the kind of pitfalls that you describe of delaying something that you then eventually have to pick up later.
Okay. That sounds like quite a long way of saying yes. And I think there's going to be things that we will want to pick up about the jets, about the support vessels, about the radar. I think I probably ought to stop there, Chair, because otherwise I'm going to pinch on everybody else.
I'll certainly bring you back in. Can I just remind committee members, because we're working from two locations, that the automated chat is a very helpful way of communicating, because I can't keep in touch with all of you by looks and by paper. So if you could keep an eye on your phones, thank you. Tobias Elwood, Chair of the Defence Select Committee.
Thank you very much indeed, and again, pleased to be here. Looking back at the SDSR 2015, it makes very clear that we want 19 destroyers and frigates, and we want 2 aircraft carriers. The consequences, though, by you saying, absolutely, we've now managed to basically manage the books, would you agree that the absence of increasing the budget when you were tasked in here to provide 2 carrier capabilities has actually dented the surface fleet capability in resources and indeed manning as well? This is before your time, so you can... No.
I certainly seek to be a chair. I mean, we have 2 carriers. We have 19 destroyers and frigates, and that's what we aim to continue. I am not for a moment denying that the budgetary pressures under which the department has laboured, certainly for all of my time there, have made the decisions, particularly actually around the destroyers and frigates, more difficult. Maintenance periods have occasionally had to be delayed. We haven't got after issues to do power propulsion as quickly as we might have liked to have done. There is no question that we have had to take decisions which we wouldn't ideally have made because of budgetary pressures. Now, do I think that is the normal course of events in defence? I suspect it probably is. Defence organisations right across the world are always under a great deal of budgetary pressure. We are no exception, and the maritime environment is no exception within that.
My concern is, Chair, if I may, is that we have 19 destroyers and frigates, which is just enough to do the 6 operational duties that we have through NATO and others that we have around the world.
Yeah.
In addition to that, you're actually wanting to develop carrier groups, quite rightly. You need to protect this carrier. It needs at least a destroyer, frigate, a submarine, and indeed other assets as well. So I put it to you that we need, hopefully, through the integrated review, there is a case to be made to actually increase the size of our surface fleet.
There is certainly that case to be made, and that debate is happening, as you would imagine, in the integrated review at the moment. I would also say that there is a case to be made for deploying our carrier group with allies, so that they can provide some of the components of a carrier strike group that we might otherwise want to deploy elsewhere. So there are a variety of different ways of skinning this particular cat.
And likewise, if I may, last point on this is to do with just the manpower as well. Manning is difficult across all 3 services, but ultimately if your defence budget, your maritime surface fleet budget hasn't increased and you're struggling with manning as well, we're going to struggle to actually make sure we have the necessary engineers to actually put these things to sea.
Yes and no. At the moment, we do not have, to the best of my knowledge anyway, any problem with manning our surface fleet. And one of the design principles behind the QE class was that it was going to be much more highly automated than, for instance, the American equivalents. I mean, they have a third the number of sailors on them as the Ford class, but 70% of the capability. Where I think there is probably more of a pinch point in terms of manning is actually in the submarine fleet, and I would absolutely agree with you there.
Final point on this is to do with the costings, if I may, is that because I believe that the pressures that you've had to face, you've ended up with an incredible asset, state-of-the-art asset, but it's actually facing or designed for low probability, high-risk events. For us to actually deal with littoral or to deal with expeditionary or humanitarian effort, yes, we can provide other additional support mechanisms. They can be placed on the ship itself. But it's much tougher to do because we've had to focus really on that single bespoke capability of high-end effort using F-35.
It's an immensely flexible capability, the carrier. It can do a huge number of HADA exercises. It can do NEO exercises, evacuation exercises, and humanitarian assistance and disaster relief exercises. It carries huge amounts of sort of helicopters and rotary wing if required. We have other assets that we deploy all the time. So while in certain situations you might be able to imagine that the carrier would be fixed in a high-end warfighting situation and we wouldn't be able to do those things, let's hope that we're not in that position and we will be able to use its full range of flexibility, because it is a very flexible asset. Indeed, if we choose to invest in it even more, we can probably make it even more flexible. But that's one of the areas where
that's the one.
That's one of the areas
that's
where
the interesting bit I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you for now, Mr. Elwood. Nick Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Sir Stephen, aircraft carrier Queen Elizabeth's on sea at the moment.
Yeah.
I understand it's got 15 aircraft on it. 5 from the UK, 10 are provided by the US Marine Corps. So what extent does the carrier strike rely on US involvement to operate in the future as a credible force?
I will pass over some of that question to Air Marshal Knighton, but I mean there will be for a while until we have brought up our F-35 fleet to critical mass, as it were. If we want to have a full complement of F-35s on the carriers, then we will have to have some American F-35s on there from the Marine Corps. There will be a moment when we have enough F-35s to be able to equip both carriers entirely with British aeroplanes. I mean, of course, the aeroplane in its own right relies on a support and logistical chain which to a certain extent is dependent on Lockheed Martin, which is the principal contractor. But obviously we have our own input into that, and we have our own arrangements around it. So there will always be a level of dependence in terms of support. There will not always be a level of dependence in terms of the actual airframes themselves. But Marshal Knighton.
I just reinforce exactly the point the Permanent Secretary made, which is that we are designing, building the carrier to deliver a sovereign capability where we will be able to deploy up to 24 F-35s, UK F-35s onto the carrier. And our objective date in the programme to deliver that is by the end of 2023, December 2023. The Americans, the US Marine Corps in particular, are quite a long way ahead in terms of their delivery profile of their F-35s. They've had operational experience of deploying their aircraft on their carriers. And I should pay tribute here to the support we've had from the US Marine Corps and the US services more generally in supporting the UK in rebuilding a carrier capability that we've not had for nearly a decade.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Do you know, the phrase sovereign capability doesn't ring true when only a third of the aircraft on our aircraft carrier are UK planes at the moment. Isn't the truth that we've overpromised and underbought?
So the short answer to that is no. I think that as I set out, our intention is to grow this capability over a period of time. By the time we get to full operating capability for carrier strike, which is the end of 2023, then we'll have sufficient aircraft and assets to be able to operate up to 24 aircraft on the carrier at a time. And that's always been the plan. We were always going to build and grow to that point. The carrier will be in service well into the 2040s and 2050s. And during that period, we will have a sovereign capability in the way I describe it. It's only during this period where we're developing and regrowing and rebuilding that capability where we will be operating alongside the Americans. The other point I'd make is aligned with what Sir Stephen said earlier, is that we see that in the future our ability to work with our allies is going to be a vital part of the way in which we deter aggression around the world. And so actually we see operating with US Marine Corps jets on board is actually a really positive thing, and proving we can do it is a really positive thing.
Can I say, when do you think we'll have 48 UK jets, and do you ever think we'll get near 138?
So the 48 aircraft, the final one of those 48 aircraft is due to be delivered in financial year 25-26. So we'll have, and we've got the funding set aside for those 48 aircraft. They're effectively on order at various stages of build and delivery. Just to be clear, we have 18 at the moment. We've got 30 more due to be delivered over the next 5 years. Beyond the 48, that's a question very much being considered at the moment as part of the integrated review and our long-term plan for that. What we know is that if we want to sustain the carriers out into the 2050s and we want to have a credible and sustainable F-35 fleet or F-35 capability, then we will need to buy more aircraft beyond the 48 to be able to sustain that capability over the long term. And that will be part of the debate and negotiation through the integrated review and spending review.
So, accepting that we're going to need to provide aircraft to 2050, 2060, knowing that you have a strategic review in hand, wouldn't it make sense to think more clearly about unmanned aircraft sooner rather than later, given the very high costs of the Lightning II craft?
Part of the debate about the future requirement for F-35 numbers revolves around what our plans are for the future combat air system and the replacement of Typhoon in the 2030s or from the 2030s. What we fully expect is that our future combat air system will be just that, a system. It'll be a combination of crewed aircraft like F-35 and uncrewed autonomous systems that support it. And we are working right now, the Air Force is working right now to develop autonomous aircraft to work alongside those aircraft we already have in service to support us in terms of defending those aircraft and allowing us to prosecute targets. These run from quite small drones, no bigger than this table, right the way up to drones that are uncrewed, but almost of the same sort of size as another combat aircraft. And there is quite a range of potential costs associated with that. And understanding what the right mix is, how technology is going to evolve and develop, is a key part of the Future Combat Air System programme that is already underway, and where we will need more investment if we want to continue along that route through into the later into the 2020s and provide the kind of capability you describe.
If I may add just one further point to that, Mr. Smith. No, of course you are right. There needs to be an uncrewed option. Our future combat air system needs to be very heavily focused around uncrewed options, and those uncrewed options need ideally to work with the aircraft that we have at the moment, the Typhoons, the F-35s. There is a complicated debate about the legal basis upon which you would be able to use lethal force in a situation like that, which is consistent with international humanitarian law. And I don't think anybody in the world knows exactly how this the interaction of technology and legal norms is going to actually play out in the next 20, 30 years, and it will be a matter of very, very considerable debate, and I suspect controversy for many, many years to come. But these are things we are thinking about at the moment.
So I absolutely accept that. One of the things we've also tried to understand on this committee previously, and indeed I sat in last week on the Defence Select Committee, was the costs of the Lightning II aircraft so far. And the project has cost about £6 billion. We paid £2 billion to get into the game when it all began. We spent, I understand, about £500 million on RAF Marham. And so far, we've got 18 planes. Now, if you were to do a crude average, they're coming in at just under £200 million a pop. And I'm sure that's wrong. There are other costs that need to be borne in mind that may be helpful for future plane purchases too. But is it Mr. Pate? What's going on here? How much are these things really costing?
So we work with the Joint Programme Office in the United States, who bring together all the contributory nations into this, excuse me, putting that in. We have seen the cost fall per aircraft, and the JPO, Joint Programme Office, stated that at the end of last year, that they expect further reductions of 13% for each of the aircraft types over the next 3 lots. So we are seeing lot by lot the price per aircraft fall, while the capability actually is increasing. We don't set out sort of lot by lot what we're paying, because that's part of the commercial consideration.
What's your best estimate at the moment on the cost per aircraft?
So I'm going to defer, if I may, to Sir Simon.
Okay, so in terms of Lot 14, which were the which has the 3 aircraft to be delivered this year, then Lot 14, $100 million. And as is just described, we're expecting further reductions in lots 15 through to 17, and that is still to be negotiated.
Okay, so what's the difference between the £3.5 billion left after the initial costs and RAF Marham and the £100 million per aircraft? What's the balance being spent on?
So we have to pay for all of the support arrangements around these. We have to pay for the ongoing upgrades, and we have to pay for the weapons integrations that are bespoke to the UK solution here. So all of that is included in the overall budget, which we've approved now up to $10.5 billion of the $13.4 billion we expect to spend on this through to programme closure in 2035. We will spend further, potentially around another $5 billion for the whole life cost. That's of the 48, and that some of that is in the report.
And so those other on costs, if you take over the cost of the $100 million per plane, what's that come to, please?
I don't have the exact breakdown between aircraft.
No, I don't.
Can you get us those
We
numbers?
can write to you on the difference between the procurement and then the ongoing support costs and other arrangements around that, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it would be very helpful. We have in the past had a private briefing on the details of the costs that can't be talked about in the public domain, and I think we're requesting another one. I think the committee speaks with one voice on that. I'm going to go to Gareth Bacon next. Mr. Bacon.
Thank you, Chair. This is to you, Sir Simon. It's Crow's Nest. We can't have this discussion without talking about Crow's Nest, because that's supposed to be crucial for the protection of the fleet, or for the carrier strike group. It's going to be delayed by at least 18 months. That was discovered relatively late, and it might not be fully operational until 2023, I understand. What's gone wrong with it?
So, I'm disappointed by where we've got to with this programme, that it was at the end of 2018 that it became apparent that there was going to be a significant delay in the programme. And indeed, that was confirmed in January 19, indeed by Atali's internal audit, which declared that they were going to be very late indeed. So what went wrong? A failure to understand the technical risk at the outset. There were delays in placing the initial contract, which compressed the timescales. And the bottom line is that the industry consortium underestimated the technical risk there and under-resourced the programme. So that's where we got to up until the start of the year. What I am pleased with is the reaction from that. Very strong engagement from Chief Executive of the three companies involved. That's Lockheed, Thales and Leonardo, with a resolution to get this aircraft ready to be part of the CSG 21 deployment. So where we are at the moment is that with the replanning and additional resourcing that's been put in there, is that we expect to have an aircraft with an initial release to service by the end of January, which will allow pilots and crews to train, and that by April of next year, when we need to be there in support of CSG 21, we will have the required functionality on Crow's Nest to be able to support the deployment.
How much cover are you going to have, though? Is that full cover of the whole group?
Well, it'll be. We'll have. It'll be able to provide the wide area surveillance that the aircraft is set out to do. It'll have a secure Link 16 capability, identification friend or foe mode 5, and an air traffic management system on there. Will it be the capability that I expected it to be at IOC? No, it won't be. And there'll be progressive software drops that will improve radar fidelity and tracking, and a number of other systems on the aircraft. That, as would be with almost all of our aircraft that we have in the fleet, there'll be progressive capability upgrades right the way through to release 14, which will be in 2023.
Okay. Are you confident that full operational capability will be achieved in 2023?
As confident as I can be. Where we are at the moment is that at least we have a firm foundation. So the initial flight trials have been carried out, so all of the handling trials are sorted out. The software that we need for the IOC is 100% coded. The issue now is the flight test and fix that happens with any complex software integration. So we're in a much better place. I think the program management that frankly was not there when we started the program and through to the delays is much better now. We have much higher fidelity on the program, and the way that the primes and the subs are working is very much improved.
I'd like to probe that last point a little bit more, because I'm interested in what went wrong. Because I understand, of course, you have to have contractors and subcontractors. But the timeline, the National Office looked into the MOD's reporting on this, and the timeline suggests that in December of 2018, the project was reporting the delivery of the IOC was achievable by the deadlines. The following month is when the Thales Corporate Internal Audit Report suggested there was going to be an extended delay and cost overruns. So what happened in between? I mean, is there an element of, I don't know, positive confirmation bias in terms of the reporting that's coming back?
Well, it became apparent to me in, I remember it actually in October 18, that the milestones weren't moving as they should be, and that actually what we were getting was milestones that were being missed, and the ramp up towards the finish line became increasingly steep. So part of it, I think, was a bit of a can-do attitude amongst industry. You always think that you can catch up, and sometimes engineers are their worst enemy here. So I think there was an optimism which we unpicked, and that unfortunately generated the 18-month delay.
So what have you changed now to make sure that the prime contractors and subcontractors are working better both with each other and with the department?
Two things. One of them is the estimation at the beginning, and making sure that estimate actually started with the prime and was carried through into the subcontractors. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think also understanding technical risk and continging for it appropriately. And with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think that was done on this programme.
Same question I asked the Permanent Secretary then at the outset, which is why, to a layman, I would have assumed that you would have already thought about this and this would be in train right from the beginning. Why wasn't it?
Well, I've asked myself that question, and actually on the face of it, this should have been relatively low risk. It was the search water radar and Cerebus mission system that was taken from Sea King Mark 7. And I just don't think, though, that they had really probed into the issue of the systems integration requirements that were there and the upgrade to the mission systems that were planned to be part of the capability going forward.
Okay, and I'm going to turn to Air Marshal Knighton, because this is the critical question, I suppose. Not having the full airborne radar capability on May 2023, what is that going to have in terms of the operational capability of the Carrier Strike Group?
So I'll just go back to the initial operating capability and what we'll have for the Carrier Strike Group 21 deployment next year. And I just want to provide reassurance to the committee that we will have a credible baseline radar capability that will enable us to search the area and protect the carrier from airborne threats. What, as Sir Simon has described, there are some elements, some modes of that radar that won't be available. So, for example, the weather mode on the radar won't be available when the aircraft deploys immediately, and it will be incrementally, the capability will be incrementally improved as the software is developed. But in terms of our ability to understand to surveil the area, to search the area, and to be able to identify potential threats and to be able to pass that information to the carrier and to the other parts of the carrier group, that will be in place. And the commander, the naval commander of the 3-star, has been personally engaged in reviewing that and is confident that we will have a credible baseline capability by the time it deploys. Between 2021 and 2023, when the full operating capability is expected to be delivered, we will, as I describe, incrementally improve that capability. It is feasible, as Sir Simon says, that we will find that that capability is neither delivered, is perhaps not as delivered as quickly as we would wish, or isn't as good as we would want it to be. But at the moment, we are planning for that to be successful. If we have to compromise on the delivery of that capability in terms of time, then we know that we've got a sufficiently credible capability. It's just not as good as we would wish it to be for the long-term the long term, or sorry, forgive me, for the life of the carrier in the 2030s and beyond. And we will be working tirelessly with the contractors to ensure that they are able to deliver that, and in the background developing contingency plans for how we'll operate if there are certain elements of the automation system or modes of the radar that are not as we would wish them to be.
Okay, so you said that there would be an operational capability, there would be a radar capability in the outset. Crow's Nest offers significantly enhanced capability from how you've just described it. Are these nice to haves from Crow's Nest, or are these absolutely integral to maximising the potential efficiency of the carrier group?
The way we think about requirements is we set both threshold and objective requirements. So threshold is the point at which references a bare minimum capability that we need in order to be able to deliver the outputs that are asked of that particular asset, in this case the carrier strike group. And the objective level are those where we would, if we are able to get to that level and we're prepared to, and the balance of investment suggests that makes sense from a value for money perspective, then we should drive at that. So I wouldn't want to describe them as nice to haves. They will enable the operator to exploit the maximum out of the capability and the technology, and will ensure that the carrier strike group is as protected as it can be. But you'll understand in military operations there is never a situation where we have no risk, and it's about trying to manage that risk appropriately. And as I say, we and the commanders involved are confident that even by next year we will have a credible baseline capability that will only improve through to 2023 and probably beyond as well.
Okay, so we're in the formative stages then of the operational capability, and it will get better. But the result of not having Crow's Nest operational until 2023 will not be putting the carrier group at more risk than it would otherwise be.
That's correct, yeah, exactly that.
Right, Chair, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bacon. Now to to Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown on Crow's Nest, and then
to
Mr. Smith.
Air Marshal, have you considered the non-conventional threats? So which I mean, we know from recent examples in Syria, low-cost Turkish drones have taken out some very sophisticated tanks, including the Russian tanks. Have you considered that threat, and have you considered an Iranian-type threat of large numbers of small boats packed full of high explosives?
So the answer to both those questions or both those examples is yes. So when we think about the carrier and the carrier strike group, it's best for us to think about it as a package which has got a layered defence. So as Mr. Elwood described, the carrier strike group will include frigates that will help us protect from undersea threats. We've got destroyers that help us protect from surface and air threats. We've also got a submarine that would be part of that full package as well. Each of those ships will have a range of weapons on board, some of which are optimised to be able to deal with fast inshore attack craft or to deal with the non-traditional threats that you describe in some kind of airborne form. So this is for the captain of the carrier and for the operational commander, this kind of assessment of the operational risk, the threats that they face depending on the location, and how to mitigate those threats and through both deterrence and defeat, should that be necessary, are a really key part of thinking through that entire layered defence. But the kind of threats you describe, Sir Geoffrey, are exactly the things that I know that the operational commanders are worried about and will seek to blunt.
Another reason why we need the SDSR to happen sooner rather than later, but I guess, however loyally, I see you nodding very vigorously there, Mr. Stephen, so and that's frustration for this committee. And talking about frustration for this committee, over to not Mick Smith, but the issue he'd like to raise. Mr. Smith, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to come back to this cost of planes malarkey. Sir Stephen, given that the Air Marshal has talked about sovereign capability, 48 planes, we learned that the base cost of each of these aircraft is $100 million. I presume there's significant on costs again. If we're going to be talking about another 30 aircraft to meet the Air Marshal's sovereign capability, it's going to be at least $3 billion, probably nearer $5 billion to get there. How likely is it the UK will be able to afford to buy and sustain this required number of aircraft? That's a lot of money to come out of your defence budget, isn't it?
Well, it is a lot of money, and it would be disingenuous to say it isn't. The Future Combat Air System, no matter how it is designed, whether or not it's F-35 very heavy or something else very heavy, is going to be a very, very, very expensive part of what defence spends its money on. What I would say about that is perhaps two things, though, to give you a bit of reassurance. One is that the costs of the flyaway costs, as it were, of the F-35 are coming down very fast. I mean, they really are coming down fast. And the F-35B is the most expensive variant of them, but that's coming down fast as well.
But you acknowledge it's going to be £4 to £5 billion for the 30 craft.
Well, I mean, it rather depends on how fast they come down. But I mean, the support costs are in many ways.
It's that order of magnitude, isn't it?
Well, I mean, yes, and one can do the maths. The second thing I would say is that this is a very, very long-term programme. We spend about £40+ billion a year, and these aircraft, or the aircraft that we may choose to develop in order to supplement them, will be being built and bought into the 2040s, 50s. So it's a long time that this capability is going to be deployed.
But I'm talking about these 48 aircraft for us to be sovereign capable. This is pretty short order expenditure, isn't it? Really?
48 aircraft are provisioned for.
Yeah.
We have a budget for that. We have a budget for the ongoing upgrade and the budget for the support of those aircraft, and the budget to operate them.
Okay. All right. Moving on to support ships.
Well, then in which case I'll bring in Mr. Elwood next, Sir Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Chair. I put it to you that 48 aircraft is not enough to run on a single aircraft carrier through its durability. I'm reminded of my O-level maths multiple choice. I took in 4 pencils, not 1, just in case I required backup. Not a second, but a third, but a fourth. And I was guaranteed to have a working pencil at any time. You'll be familiar with this. It's the force elements at readiness, which is the military's term of saying how many do we need to have operational at any one time, bearing in mind we've got to repair things, we've got to train people and so forth. So please can I ask, what is the upper number that you require to run 2 aircraft carriers?
Shall I take that? So the 48 number was calculated on the basis of having sufficient aircraft to continue to maintain and sustain the training regime, so the operational conversion unit, to continue to sustain the 3 aircraft that are permanently attributed to do test and evaluation, and to leave sufficient aircraft to have 2 operational squadrons, so that we could routinely have
2 times 12.
Yes, so that kind of order of magnitude. Which would provide the opportunity to surge to up to 24 aircraft at a time on the carrier, but more routinely would operate with a lower number, somewhere between 6 and 12, as necessary in order to be, as the aircraft carrier went on a deployment. So 48 is adequate to deliver that level of output. My point about needing more aircraft over the life is because the life of over the long term, out into the 2050s and 60s, or 2040s and 50s, the life of the aircraft is limited by design, and they will need to be replaced. And also, if we wanted to increase the capacity of that force and stand on a 3rd squadron, then you would need more aircraft.
But cutting to the chase, if we want to have, through its life scale, 2 carrier strike capabilities, then we will need to have that 138. Were we to reduce that number in any way, heading towards 48, we would affect our capability.
So when the original number 138 was developed, that was against the backdrop of the original design of the carrier, which should have 4 operational squadrons and 2 carriers operating at all times. The government's in 2010 and 2015 has taken a different view. So as I say, the number of aircraft that we have and we will have by the end of 2025 in the financial year 25-26 will be adequate to deliver those 2 squadrons. If you want to pack a bigger punch and you want to thicken that force, then you will need more F-35s. But that's a judgment around the overall size and shape of the armed forces, which brings us back, I'm afraid, again to the integrated review.
Okay, my other question is what are you flying from this carrier? It is the state-of-the-art carrier, newest in the world, and yet we only seem to be flying fast jets from it, the F-35Bs itself. When we look at others around the world, including the United States, they are already flying drone aircraft. You talked about UAVs. I don't understand at all why there isn't today a sort of concurrent timetable to put on board today Scout Eagle, Fire Scout, X-47Bs, all these things which could be utilised and far cheaper allow us to do the work that otherwise would have to be done by F-35s. Can I understand why there wasn't a parallel programme to look at how the X-47 came up in 2011. The Fire Scout's been around since the year 2000. Okay, these are now standard things. How come we don't see these on board today, not in 5-10 years' time?
So if you look at those particular capabilities you describe, and the X-47 was an experimental plane that was developed by the US Navy and requires a catapult to launch it. These aircraft carriers don't have catapults on board. We went for a short takeoff and vertical landing variant and the ski ramp off the front of the carrier. So that drives us to requiring different solutions to it. I am confident that...
Sorry, Scan Eagle, you pick on that one. Scan Eagle is found on frigates, let alone carriers. Yeah. Yet we don't have one on board ours today.
And Scan Eagle provides a short-range electro-optic search and surveillance capability. What I will say is that...
or ISTAR capability, which your crow's nest doesn't have. I'm just saying it's not there, and we have nothing. We have no drone on board at the moment. You're absolutely right. We don't have a drone on board today. One of the really important pieces of work we will need to do over the next decade is to develop the integral ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capability for all of our ships, not just the carrier strike group. And that will almost certainly be an autonomous, uncrewed system. We don't have a plan today to put that on board, but we absolutely recognise that that's an important capability that we'll need to invest in over the next few years.
Well, I think, Air Marshal, if I may say that your answers to Mr. Elwood are quite illuminating on the reason for the decision to have 48, which is a number this committee has been worried about for a while. So basically, you were clear it was a decision by government, a political decision, to trim costs, which reduced the numbers of aircraft.
I wouldn't quite go with that.
Okay, well, that's right. So I'm pushing because I was interested it was inferred, and I wasn't sure if I assumed right. So perhaps
I wouldn't quite go that far. I mean, the 138 is clearly the upper limit, I think. I mean, realistically, given 2 carriers, 138 is a very, very, very full fat.
Allowing you to guarantee
that you have that capability. Can we have one at a time? One through the chair, please.
4 squadrons, both carriers deployed sort of kind of at the same time. If you decide that you are not going to have 4 squadrons and you're not going to deploy both of the carriers at the same time, and at the moment, I think 2015 SCSR said that we were going to have 1 carrier out at a time, the other one in dock, then you don't need clearly 138 aircraft. If you choose to change the nature of the deployment patterns of the 2 carriers, and you choose to decide that you want to use them for different things, then you end up with a a different number. I mean, it's not going to be 48. It's going to be more than 48. I'm very confident it's going to be more than 48. 48 is enough for us sort of kind of right now. I mean, it would be great if there were more, but it's enough for us sort of kind of right now. It will in due course be quite a lot more than that. As I say, 138 will be the upper limit of it, though.
Okay, so actually the SDSR again comes into play because the capability, whether one or two could be deployed at the same time, really comes into play. I'm going to turn to Sir Bernard Jenkin next. Sir Bernard.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, gentlemen. I remember the 1998 Strategic Defence Review, when the concept was very much grander than what we're discussing now in terms of the number of surface ships in support and even the number of aircraft that we'd be ordering, which was, I think then, more than 138, if I remember correctly. And it's been, the capability has been pared back, and then we find ourselves finishing up talking about how valuable this is going to be for peace support operations or aid operations. We're not going to get, I want to ask about the value for money, because we're buying some very expensive capability. And unless we can scale up, how can we justify this enormous expense? And I think that's what Tobias Elwood is really asking about. So were we to find ourselves, the incidence of state-on-state warfare is expected to increase. So the expectation is that we must be ready for high-intensity warfare, high-intensity operations. To what extent will we be able to sustain losses from this very limited inventory we now are planning for, in order to be able to actually sustain the capability in a war?
So, Stephen.
It is clearly the case that if we are to equip the carriers with the minimum number of aircraft in a high-intensity warfight, there is going to be attrition quite quickly at this level that we would not be able to sustain. And at that point, the utility of the carrier becomes very, very, very much reduced, which is one of the reasons why we will be buying more F-35Bs in order to be able to make sure that that situation doesn't happen. I mean, it is clearly not the case that we can conjure them up just like that. They're expensive things to build. They take a bit of time to appear. We're going to get our full first 48 in over the next 5 years, and there will be a decision coming up as to how many more we get over the period after that. The point I was seeking to make about the aircraft carrier is not only that it is an immensely potent capability for a high-end warfight, admittedly surrounded by all of the other capabilities that Mr. Elwood was talking about earlier on, and it is certainly true that it needs anti-submarine warfare frigates, it needs anti-aircraft destroyers, it needs hunter-killer submarines in that kind of situation, but it is also a capability which is capable of projecting Britain's power in the world without some of those things, and capable of doing a variety of other tasks as well. It is a very, very full and capable piece of equipment. So I have no doubt that it will be value for money, but the precise, I don't think that this particular capability, when you look at the range of things that it can do in all of the different situations that it might be deployed in, I think it is not going to be very susceptible to a very straightforward value for money calculation. I guess that would be my answer. That may not satisfy you, Sir Bernard, but I think that would be as good as I can get.
Well, could I just make a suggestion that what's required is for the department to write a maritime strategic aviation concept which builds in this idea of scaling up, in order that what we are projecting now and what we might be projecting, say, in 10 years' time, actually carries with it the credibility of the sustainable punch, should it need to do so. And that needs a backing, if you like, of some defence industrial policy to support the scaling up.
I take that suggestion absolutely on board. I think it would be fair to say that within the department, exactly that kind of thinking has been done and continues to be done. What I don't think that we have done is reveal it to the world, and I think that there is a deterrence and persuasive force to the argument for making it more public, and I will take that away and speak to ministers about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Bennett. Barry Gardner, if you could unmute, please, Mr. Gardner. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Could I ask Mr. Pate a question, please, Chair? Because, Mr. Pate, you said, and I believe the Permanent Secretary also then reinforced it, that the cost of the jets was coming down, and yet at paragraph 1.16 of the NAO report, it says the department has increased the approval limit 4 times since we reported in 2017, an increase of £1.4 billion, 15%. Now, so does that mean that when you say the cost is coming down, you're talking about the basic procurement of each jet?
Yes, that's right, Mr. Gardner. The basic price of each jet is coming down, and that was what I was referring to with the next 3 lots, falling over 13%. May I explain the increase in that cost that is referred to in the report?
Well, I think it's explained in that paragraph where it says it is a strategy of incremental acquisition, and the approvals were for capability upgrades, integration of UK weapons, and sustainment costs. So I presume the capability upgrades were to those jets, that the compatibility upgrades, the integration of UK weapons, were for those jets. So isn't it really semantics that you're playing with when you say the cost has come down? Because there's not much point of having a jet that doesn't have that capability or is incompatible with UK weapon systems, is it?
So this is an agreed and understood part of the programme that we would, the overall F-35 would go through a process of continuous upgrade, and actually it will continue that through its life. Included with that is the integration of the UK weapon systems onto that. So again, that was known at the start and was an agreed part of the programme.
Well, you see, it was known at the start, but this is actually an approval uplift, isn't it, since 2017. So in the past 3 years, the cost has actually risen by £1.4 billion. As the NAO report states, this is how we do incremental approvals within an agreed overall whole life cost, which I referred to earlier, of around £13.5 billion through to programme closure at the end of 2035. What we don't do is approve all of that right at the start, mostly because we need to work through the SRO and the various programme teams working on this, the precise costings of each element. As those become clearer, we then take those through the Investment Approvals Committee, which I chair, and then through to ministers and the Treasury as required, so that we are putting sensible bounds around different elements of the programme. The alternative, frankly, would have been to have given an approval for the whole life cost right at the start, or the overall programme cost at the start. And I would suggest that reduces control that we need on this programme going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Gardner, one last one then, please. One last very quick one.
Sorry, there was a whole life cost of £18.425 billion. But the final question then, Chair, that I would wish to put perhaps to the Permanent Secretary, and that is, in 2015, the department announced that it intended to pursue 138 jets and committed to operating the 2 squadrons. Now, the way you were talking in response to Mr. Elwood and Sir Bernard Jenkins seemed to hold that as if it might not be the case. Has there been any change from that announcement in 2015?
The position stands at the SDSR of 2015, where there was announced an intention to have 138 F-35s. We have a funded programme to buy, actually contractually, 48 of them, leaving 90 left over. Since then, things have certainly moved on, and the thinking around what a future combat air system will require us to operate in order to replace those typhoons that, as Air Marshal Knighton mentioned, were coming out of service in the late 2030s, is beginning to change the way in which we are thinking about what the totality of the combat air fleet is going to be. And as a result of that, that will be one of those subjects which is going to be discussed in the IR.
And we need to move on now, Mr. Gardner. Nick Smith.
Thank you, Chair. Air Marshal, so we all understand that carrier strike is a massive logistical challenge, and initially it was planned to have 3 supply ships. So should a carrier be in a dangerous place, how would the UK maintain a sustained high tempo carrier deployment if we've got what I understand is a fantastic RFA Fort Victoria as the only solid support ship available? How are we going to make sure that supplies and fuel and backup munitions are in place to support our Navy?
As you described, the solid support ship programme was the 4th leg of the 4 parts of the carrier-enabled power projection, and in order to sustain the delivery of that capability through life, then we currently estimate that we're going to need 3 of those fleet solid support ships. We need 3 because you would expect 1 or 2 of them potentially to be in some kind of maintenance over time. So until we have got all of those ships in service, we will have to rely on Royal Fleet Auxiliary Ship Fort Victoria, and we will, as a consequence of that, have to think through how much of our spares and stores we need to preload onto the ship. We will have to think about what the potential rates of consumption will be depending on the environment in which the ship is operating. And where necessary, as I say, we'll either have to pre-position spares on board the ship and stores on board the ship. We'll have to potentially seek support from our allies, but fundamentally we will be seeking to manage the consumption of our stock and our spares based on the operational demand of the time, and we will match the load out of the carrier and the load out of RFA Fort Victoria to enable us to do that. But inevitably we should have, we will be constrained in the way we have to operate if we only have RFA Fort Victoria, which is what we've known about since the inception of the programme, because the Fleet Solid Support ships since back in 2011 have been pushed back in terms of the timing of when they'd be delivered.
Okay, so Air Marshal, what you've said is that if we think it's going to be difficult, we put loads of material on the aircraft carrier and we rely on our allies to help us out should it happen short term, but that could really be difficult, couldn't it? Mr. Bollom, the Air Marshal has just given you what we used to call, when I used to play rugby, a hospital pass, because he's saying we need 3 ships. So, why has the Ministry of Defence consistently failed to order these ships?
Well, as you no doubt referring, we had the Fleet Solid Support programme, where the intention was to go out to the market to purchase 3 ships. As of last year, we got to the end of the bid process, and we got to the point where we didn't have a compliant bidder, and so on the 5th of November that competition was stopped. That has then taken us into, again, the integrated review area, and we are now sort of considering the requirement, and we stand ready to launch a further competition when it's instructed.
Okay, it does feel a little bit like jam tomorrow and waiting for the review to come Thank you, Mr. Bollom. Sir Stephen, why is there still no funded permanent solution for the maritime intra-theatre lift?
I'm going to refer that one to the Air Marshal, if I may.
Thank you, Chair. So we do have a maritime inter-theatre lift. It's an interim solution that's provided by the Merlin. They are currently, two embarked currently on the carrier. That will provide the capability that we need to be able to operate the carrier for the foreseeable future. The maritime intra-theatre lift requirement is about moving spares, people and potentially high value assets around the fleet and potentially also to shore. We will need to find a long-term solution well into the 2030s and 40s, and in fact, coming back to Mr. Elwood's earlier question, I anticipate that in the future that will be an uncrewed system, autonomous system of some form. But for the foreseeable future, the Merlin Mark IV will give us the capability that we need to be able to operate the carrier. And the experience we've gained from looking at the USS Essex deployment and our own experience of through a number of deployments the carrier suggests that for the moment that Merlin capability is perfectly adequate to deliver what's required.
Mr. Smith.
Last one for me on this section, this sort of bundle of support questions. Sir Stephen, how likely is it that you'll be able to meet your target and declare carrier strike interim operating capability in the coming December with all the criteria having been met, including Crow's Nest? How likely?
Very likely. I mean, we've talked about the inevitably slightly more limited nature of the Crow's Nest capability at some length, but in terms of the initial operating capability, very likely. Thank you very much.
Tobias Elwood.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to turn, if I may, well, firstly, just on that, there seem to be a number of weak links. There's inadequate logistical support, no Crow's Nest, limited ISTAR, and then there's also the absence of indigenous carrier refuelling. Is this something that the integrated review is going to be able to reconcile?
Good question. Sir Stephen.
We will certainly be setting out plans to be able to bring these various components together. But I do think it's important that we recognise that we are talking about the very, very complicated interweaving of a number of different, in their own right, very complicated capabilities, which we have not had for over a decade, and in that decade, technology has moved on a lot. It grieves me and pains me to say that there are going to be teething troubles in making sure that this capability works absolutely seamlessly, but that is just the reality of it. It will take a few years probably for us to really understand how best to make this work. I mean, an absolutely crucial part of learning about what we've got, and we are still in that phase, learning about what we have, will be the deployment in 2021 through the Gulf and the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific. And after that, we will be coming back and we will be very happy to tell you what we have learnt about it. Sitting here right now with this very, very new capability, it's tough. It's tough.
So I genuinely don't know how much the Treasury get any of this and the importance of it, the absence of which actually has an impact on the capability. It's important that we do share, and we want to work with you, or something my committee does, to make this case for the integrated review. Yeah. Moving just on to the potency of the munitions, the weapon systems that are actually on board. Ultimately, this is why the aircraft carrier is there. And there's posture and so forth and status, but ultimately it's the lethality, the accuracy of the bombs or missiles that are actually dropped, or the air supremacy that you're able to gauge. So can I ask whether you believe that the utility that you have in what's in the magazine at the moment is actually equally shared amongst all the assets that are on board the aircraft carrier?
Sorry, Mr. Orwell, do you mean as in the air-launched munitions for the F-35?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm getting at is that we actually have some amazing kit. NBDA makes some of the most incredible weapon systems exported around the world. They're not used, all of them, on the F-35. Neither are they used actually on the Merlin either. So going back to the versatility and the flexibility and the power projection and so forth, what we've purchased, the F-35, is actually quite bespoke in what it can, what you can strap to it from stealth mode or otherwise. The Merlin itself is actually more of a passive. It's not a. I'm asking why haven't we advanced Brimstone or even Storm Shadow onto the Merlin? Why isn't Merlin used as a refueling? Because as I understand it, there's no indigenous mid-air refueling capability for the F-35B.
Okay, so there's quite a lot in there. If I start with the weapon systems, so we foresee over time an incremental development and release of weapons clearances on F-35, and that just takes time. So taking a complex weapon, integrating it into a complex aircraft with a complex mission system is a serious feat of engineering, and that just takes some time. I'm confident that over the next few years we will increase the number of UK-built weapons that we integrate onto F-35, and one of the most significant components of that will be Spear Cat 3, Spear Capability 3, which we think will be a really important component of that arsenal, and as you say is an NBDA developed weapon. When the aircraft deploy at CSG-21, they will be armed with capability that gives us confidence that they can be used in an operational sense should we need to. The point you made about air-to-air refuelling, so that there is no intention for us to put an air-to-air refueling capability onto the carrier in its current form. The concept of carrier operations is such that you're able to put the carrier closer to the target, and therefore there is less requirement for air-to-air refueling. And if you were in the circumstances, perhaps in the Gulf, where you might want to operate the carrier, and this is exactly what the USS Essex did, is that the aircraft that come off the carrier are able to refuel from the likes of our Voyager or a US or another country's asset as part of the integrated capability. The international operation that's being run over the Middle East. And that would be the way in which we would apply it.
Could I encourage, please, that greater effort is made to use the spectrum of weapon systems that we have in a cleverer way? The Brimstone should be able to be used on the Merlin, also on the Apache, on the Wildcat and so forth, and even on a main battle tank. We tend to be very siloed in what we're doing with these weapon systems when they're going to be in the magazine of the carrier itself. You may have Apache on it in circumstances. We saw that in Op LME. So I'm simply asking that it seems to continues to be a very siloed approach as to what the weapon systems that we use, even though we have an incredible spectrum of capability.
And it's slow. Actually, is the other.
Marshal,
if I might just provide just a small amount of reassurance. So Brimstone is one of the options we're considering for integration onto Apache. We won't be fitting weapons to Merlin, the ASW, the Airborne Early Warning platform, because of the operational. The way in which it is used operationally is you need to have that asset focused on delivering its airborne early warning capability. We deliver the strike capability through some of the missiles, which are again UK-built weapons that are fitted to the likes of a Wildcat.
But the cost of flying your Lightning II is, I think, 10 times more than the cost of flying a Merlin. Mm-hmm. Nobody's going to complain the other end, the fact that a Storm Shadow has come off one.
We're in danger of getting into conversation here.
So how come you're not allowing Merlin to be more versatile, to be able to do both roles?
Marshal.
So Storm Shadow is a large weapon.
Right, I give that.
I think we're in danger, Mr. Elwood, of replaying Defence Select Committee necessarily with discussing individual capabilities. If you'd like to ask a question, then we can.
I just want to see greater versatility. If Merlin is on board, then it's a flying asset that can be used. There's an array of weapon systems in your magazine. Can we have the foresight to allow greater versatility in the airborne assets that you have.
I think Mr. Orwell makes a very good point about making sure that we maximise the investment we've made in our weapons
and the effectiveness
using them
of
on as many platforms as we can.
Absolutely, the effectiveness of what Carrier Strike can achieve. I want to move on a bit to costs, if I may, and I'll come back to colleagues afterwards. But Mr. Pate, we're going through a pandemic. There's lots of money being spent. Lots doesn't even begin to describe it. Spent by the Treasury. Have you had any conversations with the Treasury about potential impacts on your budget?
From the pandemic?
Yeah.
Yes, we're weekly in touch with the Treasury, as you can imagine. So there are two main areas that we've been talking to them about. The first is on our operational support and where we've done that, and Sir Stephen described earlier about our military civilian authorities work. But we've done that on marginal cost basis. Okay. So we are clearly identifying the costs. Then more broadly, it's the impact on the department's business. The clearest of those is the position of the pound. We've discussed on several occasions foreign exchange. So we are keeping that dialogue with the Treasury. We're also just making sure we identify where we do think we have specifically either spent or in fact lost income as a result of the pandemic.
Well, and obviously the Forex issue is a critical one, but in terms of, is there any hint from the Treasury that in a future spending review you might have to offer up extra savings? Because obviously a small saving in the Ministry of Defence percentage-wise is a large saving for other departments. So track record from the last 3 years is we've received £3 billion around that additional from the Treasury. We're in discussion about what we think we require, and we'll find the result in the coming months. In the coming months. Have you had any indication when the spending review is going to happen?
Well, as Stephen said, it has to be before the end of November to release the local government settlement. That's all the timing we've heard. Okay.
Well, I won't repeat all our questions on that as we go through, but. When we're looking at Carrier Strike, what work have you done to establish what enhancements are needed and what they will cost? Because there's obviously options, as we've been discussing, but have you costed them all?
So again, in three areas, there are, and the NAO report makes clear the existing budgets around support, which includes maintenance but also upgrades as they're required, including on the F-35. As we've described, but also on the other capabilities. There are then the operating costs, where we have taken what we can from the trials and the understanding of these capabilities. But again, as Sir Stephen said, we need to go through Carrier Strike Group in 2021, and that will give us a much better understanding of what these things actually cost to when we are operating them properly, and we'll feed that back in. And then the third area is, as we understand the lifetime of the current capabilities we've got and how those will develop, those feed into our equipment planning and programming in the normal fashion. So some of those are part of the sort of back end of the 10 years which we discussed in the previous hearing. Actually, others go well beyond even this 10-year time frame.
And clearly 2021 is a critical year for determining capability but also costs. So how quickly can you pivot if something is proving too expensive? And I'm going to come to Marshal Knighton about what he might have to de-scope as a result. But how quickly will you be able to make that change if there is a big overrun? So from
operating costs, we do just have to understand that relative to our overall £40 billion budget, these are not sort of the main costs within that. And where we are operating a Carrier Strike Group, we won't be doing other things with those assets. So I think there is some displacement there. Further, if we are, and this isn't the case for CSG 21, but if the National Security Council decides on the use of the Carrier Strike Group, we can then go into discussion with the Treasury over access to the Special Reserve, just as we do for Operation Shader and other types of that, where we require funding above what we are normally funded for normal running costs. So I think we have a couple of avenues there before I have to go to Air Marshal Knighton and see what we are having to reprogram.
I'm interested to know what the status will be of the Special Reserve after we've got the COVID bill in front of us. In one level capability-wise, but have you had any discussions with Treasury about an impact on that?
So the Special Reserve for us is for the military operations, and that has been falling over recent years given activity. I haven't discussed with the Treasury on the overall COVID bill. No.
So, Air Marshal Knighton, if it doesn't go well, 2021 we've got COVID impacts as well. What might you have to de-scope? Have you been thinking about what we've been talking about? other things with Mr. Elwood there, but what might you have to drop off carrier strike in order to trim it, if you had to? You must have been having discussion. We've had lots of. I think the last time we met, not last time, maybe a couple of times ago, it was whether the Royal Marines would have anything to do with carrier strike, for example. And we've heard some examples from Mr. Elwood. So what are the ones that are seriously in play?
So I thought the question you were going to ask was around what you would do across the rest of the defence budget, which is a topic of considerable discussion with as we think through the potential financial scenarios and the outcome of the integrated review, and this very thorough examination of the UK's position in the world and the capability that is required for it. In terms of carrier strike itself, we judge that carrier strike remains a really vital component of the UK's military capability and military power. And it's an important symbol of our position in the world. Of our allies, only the US operates more than 2 carriers, and we would seek to prioritise the investment that we have planned to deliver the carrier strike capability, and would therefore potentially have to look elsewhere in the rest of the defence programme. If the judgment were made by ministers that actually they no longer wanted to privilege and prioritise investment in carrier strike, then clearly we would look at what the future investment plans were and where we could go to make savings. But I think, Chair, if I may, to speculate over how we might prioritise within the carrier strike programme would perhaps not be helpful. And secondly,
well, it wouldn't be helpful to you, but there's a lot of speculation, out there, and we see things like the tanks that Mr. Holden raised at the beginning floated in the press. We saw, as I say, it was Royal Marines a few years ago. There are different things being floated out there. I suspect some of them have some grain of some seed is sown somewhere in the Ministry of Defence or in Armed Forces.
On the carrier strike itself, one of the key points, and really going back to the very first questions from Mr. Bacon, is that to deliver a credible capability from carrier strike, you need to have all of the components in place. And if you don't have some of those components, then you'll be compromised. So that's why we really do need to, that's why we're managing it as a whole programme, and that's why we need to move forward as a whole programme. Taking bits out or components out will undermine the programme and the value for money.
And you said it, and it's one of the concerns we've had all the way through, as you know, from this committee, and I know the Defence Select Committee has issues as well. I just want to turn to Sir Simon Bollom. Can you afford the wider capability? If carrier strike is fully delivered, can you afford everything else that is currently on the table?
It's a difficult question for me to answer because I turn to my colleague Rich Knighton and
from your perspective, then I'll go to the others and I'll bring in this.
Well, I will. So what I will give you some assurance is now the way. So the budget is allocated for me to place contracts to provide support, and I'm never comfortable with a budget, but in terms of sustaining the elements of the carrier task group, then I don't have any major concerns at this time. But one of the things that we will get from the first deployment, CSG 21, is the learning that we need. The carriers, of course, are very new. The material state of those is improving. Similarly with Type 45 as well, but in terms of deploying them as a task group, it will stretch our lines of communication and our ability to support those task groups, and we will build that experience as we go through and do the best we can within the budget.
I appreciate you saying it will stretch it. So, Sir Stephen, it's going to be. It didn't take much, does it? It's pretty stretched already.
I guess we've had versions of this conversation.
It feels a bit like Groundhog Day.
It does feel a tiny bit like Groundhog Day. It is no secret, nor have we ever tried to disguise the fact that the defence budget is under very considerable pressure. and that has been the case for quite a long period of time. There are a variety of reasons for that. Some of the previous integrated reviews or SGSRs were very, very fully specified without necessarily having the funding associated with them. There has been optimism bias, and in particular, and this is something that we have discussed at great length in the past, much of it has historically been predicated on efficiency targets which have been very, very ambitious and ultimately impossible to execute. In fact, currently we have 26 billion pounds worth of efficiencies that we know we're going to get in the next 10 years. But we need to find another 9. But even that leaves us sort of kind of a bit short. So the task for this integrated review, and the task that all of us and many of the colleagues in the department are engaged in, is to have a balanced review which gets the equipment programme and the outputs back into a degree of equilibrium with the finances that we have to deliver them. And that's what it is all about. So I hope that
Stephen,
that's
you've
what we
just
get.
laid out your tasks ahead. So a good moment, I think, to bring in Mr. Nick Smith. Nick Smith, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And none of us wants to lose the battle for the want of a nail. So I've got to press you, Mr. Bollom. I understand in November 2019, Air Command postponed buying a second Lightning II deployment spares pack for 1 year on affordability grounds. So, have you established the level of spares you need to operate all elements of the carrier strike group, and have you got the funding necessary to provide it in the future? Have we got enough nails?
My judgment is that as I've said earlier, it's going to be tight, and one of the issues that we will face that we haven't thus far is deploying the aircraft in a maritime environment. That puts additional stresses on the aircraft. It means that in terms of stockpiles, you've got to have a very carefully worked strategy as to where you're actually going to resupply the task group. So my judgment at the moment is it will be tight, but we will manage the risk. And one of the benefits of working alongside a sister service with the US Marine Corps is that we'll be able to share that risk to some extent. But if the question is always, would you like more? Yes, we can always make do with more, but it's a case of optimising the spares buy to what is affordable.
Marshal Knighton?
I'll just add to that. So I think it is fair to say that over a number of years we have not prioritised investment in support in the way that we should have done. And I've on record in front of the Defence Select Committee and here in front of the Public Accounts Committee to say that one of the first priorities, should we have more funding available for me, would be to invest in support. They're not very sexy things, spares and stockpiles, but they do enable us to extract the most value out of the assets that we have. And so it's a key factor in our thinking as we go into the integrated review, is to make sure that we've got appropriate support to enable us to operate our aircraft and other assets on a global scale and to meet the government's appetite and intent for the UK to be properly engaged right around the world. So it's a really important issue that you identify, and it's very high on our priorities when we think about investment into the future.
Mr. Smith?
I think I've covered it.
Okay, Mr. Elwood.
Thank you. Moving to the integrated review, on a wider scheme of things, you touched on the importance of this carrier strike capability. Interesting that you're willing to focus on that and perhaps at the cost of other things. Can you elaborate how you see the aircraft carrier being utilised? Have you been given any instruction or direction to say, we anticipate greater focus in the South China Sea, in the Middle East, near HMS Jafir. Have you been given any instruction as to where this will fit in the next 10, 15 years?
Precise details about that obviously are not really, I guess, for airing in this committee, but we have been given a clear instruction by the Prime Minister that he expects defence to be more actively deployed and working in a greater number of situations in more places around the world in order to make sure that we are playing our full part in promoting British values of all types. I do think that the carriers are going to be a very important part of that, and I think CSG 21 going as it does right through the Gulf, Indian Ocean and into the Pacific is a good example of that. Exactly how that plays out in future years, I don't know, but I think you can see, you can expect to see more people with more assets doing more things more of the time in defence in the coming years, and the carrier will be a big part of that.
Would you also agree that the surface fleet, our maritime presence, is going to be ever more important, given that we're going to be wanting to develop new market opportunities post-Brexit in other parts of the world, and there's a growing threat, if you like, of interest from Russia and China as they expand their interests as well. Have you made that case to the Treasury to say that if you want to secure these prosperity lines, these new opportunities, you're going to have to increase the size of our Navy?
We have made those arguments, yes.
And what was their response?
They are considering those arguments at the moment, I think.
Endlessly waiting for the defence review. I'm going to bring in Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown. Over to you, Sir Geoffrey.
The report makes quite clear that these aircraft carriers are going to need to be refurbished every 6 years. Have you purchased the capability to do that, and will that be at Glenmallan or will it be at Portsmouth, possibly via a dry dock?
We have thought about that, and at the moment I think there are 5 capabilities in the UK that are sufficient size to accept the carrier. So our plan at the moment, it's about a 6-week maintenance period, as you rightly say, every 6 years, and we'd probably put it out to competition.
And when is that going to happen?
It's 6 years into the...
No, I didn't mean when will the maintenance go, but when are you going to put it out to competitive tender?
Oh, not for several years yet.
Okay.
So we'll do that on, sorry, to be clear, we'd do that on a case-by-case basis.
But we know it's going to happen in 6 years' time, so presumably these things don't happen in 5 minutes.
No, but we do have facilities in the UK, I think it's 5 as I said, that we can do that.
So on the basis that these aircraft carriers might, in some circumstances, want to be operated independently of our allies, I'm thinking of a Falklands-type situation.
Yeah.
Why are we not thinking about purchasing any air refuelling for our Lightning jets?
Well, I think I'd probably defer to
yes, esteemed
Marshal Knighton, actually, his earlier answer. Yeah. So,
and forgive me, I think you may have been out of the room when I answered the question about air-to-air refuelling.
I'm sorry, I probably was. If you've answered it, fine, we'll move on. It has been mentioned during this hearing that we will be seeking increasingly, and you said this to Tobias, of manufacturing our own weapons systems. How will that work interoperability with American Lightning jets on our own ships if they have different weapon systems?
So that's exactly the situation we will face when we deploy on Carrier Strike Group 21. There are some specific weapons that will be for the US deployment that will sit in the magazine alongside the UK weapons. The advantage of it being a multinational programme is that once a weapon is cleared onto the aircraft, it's cleared effectively on all aircraft, whichever nation owns them. So actually that provides us with a degree of flexibility when we think forward into an operational scenario. It also provides an opportunity for British weapons that are cleared on F-35 for those to be sold to other F-35 users, and potentially opens up a market for them as well.
I get the flexibility argument, but coming back to Nick Smith's question about spares, doesn't it make logistics and spares very much more difficult if you've got different weapon systems for two different types of aircraft?
Forgive me, I'm not sure I quite understand the question.
You've got an American weapon system on some of the Lightnings and a British weapon system on British Lightnings on the same aircraft carriers. Doesn't it make the logistics of that operation far more difficult?
Not particularly. As I say, that's exactly the model we're going to employ for Carrier Strike Group 21, and that the magazine is large enough to hold the weapons that we require. We've done a lot of work over the last 2 or 3 years to get US weapons cleared into the UK magazine. So that's not been without its challenges, but actually, when it comes to the deployment, we don't anticipate any difficulties at all.
Right. Finally, something you said, you said you wanted the aim of these aircraft carriers is to put them as close as possible to the threat. You can keep them safer by keeping them away from the threat. And all that we've heard today regarding numbers of jets, radar, support ships, ISTAR capability, when are we going to be in a position to be able to deploy these aircraft carriers in the maximum sensible area of threat?
So once we reach initial operating capability at the end of the year...
that's in 2023, but you still won't have the full suite of support, ships and capability by 2023, will you?
That's correct. So we won't have the Fleet Solid support ships in service by that stage, but we will be able to deliver a carrier strike capability. And as I described earlier, and exactly as the question was asked, that only having RFA Fort Victoria will affect our flexibility and the scheme of manoeuvre. We'll have to think about how we support those deployments with spares and where we put them. But I'm confident that from when we reach the initial operating capability at the end of the year, should the government decide it wanted to deploy the carrier in an operational role to deliver lethal force on behalf of the United Kingdom, it would be able to do that.
So you would be able to get to the optimum areas of threat in 2023. And would that be dependent on allies, or would we be able to do it in an independent situation like the Falklands?
We could definitely do it in a circumstance like the Falklands. I mean, more generally, we would expect most of our operations in the future to be done in some form of coalition, and the operational design and laydown of the forces will be dependent on who the allies are, what the particular task is. But if your question is specifically, could we deploy the carrier and operate it in the South Atlantic? Without question, we could.
Just slightly refine that question. If it were a peer-to-peer adversary, would we still be able to deploy those aircraft carriers in the maximum area of threat that we would like to be able to under any circumstances?
So my judgment would be that if we are about to find ourselves in a peer-on-peer conflict, we would definitely be doing that with allies, and our wargaming and our planning work on the assumption that we will work together with our allies to protect our high-value assets and deliver the kind of operational punch that's going to be required in those kind of circumstances.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Geoffrey. Sir Bernard Jenkin, very quickly.
Thank you very much. Ironic, these last questions are so germane. We're interested in bang for buck. Now, what kind of cost-benefit analysis does the department do to work out how much more optimal this capability could be if we had on-board refueling capability, so that we could extend the range of the aircraft and make up for the fact that the carrier itself can't be put in such harm's way we can extend the range of the aircraft with carrier on-board refueling. And the same goes with carrier on-board long-range radar, which we had on the FA2 in the Falklands, by the way, almost by accident, and became such an essential component of the whole fleet's defence. How do you do the cost-benefit analysis to work out whether those add-ons are actually worth much more than some of the fixed costs that we're adding to the programme anyway?
Marshal.
I'll answer part of it, and I'll invite Charlie Pate to comment as the chair of the Investment Approvals Committee. So when we describe them as a balance of investment judgment. So we are trying to decide where we should invest in order to deliver an output, an outcome that defence wants. And we run a whole range of mechanisms by which we might do that. So we might run a combined operation evaluation and investment appraisal. We might run a mechanism called multi-criteria decision analysis, which is quite a useful technique for us being able to identify the relative importance and value in terms of an output or an increase in capability against a specific cost. And so we will apply those techniques at different points in the life cycle. So multi-criteria decision analysis is particularly useful when you're making broad balance of investment judgments. We've been through 2 cycles of that in 2018 and 2019 to inform our thinking around the modernising defence programme priorities, and also in what we thought was going to be spending review 19, which then didn't happen. And those enable us to compare, as a colleague of mine used to describe it, as apples and Tuesdays, by trying to provide a common assessment of the relative value that you get. And the advantage of that methodology is that it's about relative value and then cost. When it comes to investment approvals, then there will be cost-benefit analysis undertaken as part of that investment appraisal. But Charlie Pate might be able to...
Thank you, Mr. Pate. Briefly.
All I would add to that is, yes, so we do that analysis, but sort of unlike most other departments where it's primarily financial and economic, ours is based more on the risk and the threat and the effect that investment will have against us. Helping to treat that risk. So that is how we look at those and prioritise in the way that the Air Marshal has described.
So Stephen,
well, it was actually just to amplify Mr. Pate's point. But if it was absolutely clear and straightforward and stable, that the range of risks that face the country and our citizens was going to be the same all the time, multi-criteria decision analysis would be all you needed to do. But the reality is that the risk changes all the time, the nature of the threat changes all of the time, and even in my time in the department, the kinds of capabilities which we need to fight in the grey zone, on a constant basis, sometimes unacknowledged, have risen up the NCDA sort of a long way, and that will just continue to happen. So every judgment is ultimately exactly that, a judgment. We can try and make it as empirically well founded as we can,
and we will help you do that.
And you indeed do help us do that. And debate of this type is extremely important for us. But it is a question of which threats you are seeking to protect against, and that is ultimately a question of policy as much as anything else.
Well, I think, Sir Stephen, you've just helpfully for yourself laid out the challenge to your political masters on that, and we know that part of your appearance today is no doubt putting in your word for the SDSR and the spending review, and we know as a committee how frustrated we are that the spending review has not taken place. And in this particular area of spending, it's absolutely vital that both take place as soon as possible. I think I know I speak for the committee on that, and that's not a party political point, that is just practically what we've got to get on with. But can I thank you very much indeed for your time, for appearing in front of us in person. We look forward to a private briefing on the jets. We've had it before, so I know for new members of the committee it would be particularly useful.